welcome to the Stoner Story Witch podcast. My name is Kristen, and it is a pleasure to be hosting and working here on the lands of the Chorotega people. I am joined today by my husband and partner, Kevin, who is who is going to just sort of also be here acting as, we're going to try it out, being like a sound producer slash editor, because I was finding myself today feeling really motivated to get a podcast out because we have a full moon in Aries coming up on Thursday. We're recording this on Tuesday. And I was noticing just this feeling that there is this like brick wall that I'm up against because it's just been a while since I've been in that app and working on things. And my husband, luckily, has been spending a lot of time in this software lately and is very comfortable with it. And I did a very hard thing, and I made a request. Would you help me record and just kind of keep an eye on things and just sort of, I guess just companion me as I'm recording this. And it's not lost on me that I did the entire first season by myself. It was my, like, we jokingly would say like my day one tarp or my season one podcast. Like, it felt really meaningful to kind of fuck around and find out. And I'm just noticing that there is so much in just the month that I haven't been recording and putting out podcasts because it's been eclipse season, that I have so much more that I want to be sharing, and that I notice that the bottleneck of capacity really is at like just all the technology that goes into doing a podcast. And so I just feel really grateful that my partner is taking time out of his busy day and his creative endeavors to join me. So thank you, Kevin.
You're more than welcome. And I told you that my price for doing this was for you to tell me how great I am, and you did. And so, and I know that that's not an easy thing to do. Yep.
Yeah. And this is the same Kevin Carlo, everybody, that helped. I would say, even though you were not around for the recording of the actual podcasts, your work is very heavily featured in the music for the podcast, which of course would not be what it is without your flair. So thank you for that as well.
And we were just discussing adding a potential little twist to the intro music for season 2. I know.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you for keeping me on track. That's why we're paying you the big bucks, which is to say not at all, or in sourdough rather. This episode is about a little bit of just an update in just what this last month has been. I believe I kind of left season 1 with kind of wanting to take a little bit of a breather and just kind of see what the next chapter was bringing. And I think I'm coming in with some things to share, and also featuring the upcoming season that I have planned as well. So
I'm excited. Let's dive in.
All right. So the tagline, or I guess maybe the title of today's episode, is I think going to be the ManifestDough, which is what I believe is the title of the poem, the sourdough poem that I read in episode 0 of the very first podcast episode of the Stoner Story Witch, and also what kind of got us into season 1.
Love me a good wordplay.
Oh God, I love me a good wordplay. But then right after I wrote that down, I just wrote the words promises, or right after I wrote the manifesto, I wrote process, promises, pleasure, purpose, and polyamory, which continues to be, the polyamory bit continues to kind of, it's a reminder of sometimes that I get so fixated on things have to be either one way or they can't be that way. Like it's either this or it's nothing. Like it's this all or nothing or binary thinking. And it's the idea that, well, if I want to do a podcast on Hadestown, why am I spending time doing a podcast on Little Women? Or why am I watching any other story or reading any other book than what it is that I'm committed to for like whatever I've devoted this season of the podcast to be. And I think that what feels really meaningful is just recognizing that like a healthy creativity ecosystem is about having lots of things going on at once. So I'm literally making sourdough right now. And during our break, we're pressing record on the podcast. And how can these things actually all work together?
And it's letting go of the idea of that things are supposed to be a certain way and that you get to write your own rules.
Yes. A lot. That is definitely, and I think a theme of season 2 is around like the ways that we've kind of been institutionalized or domesticated or been put into like kind of a captivity of like what is acceptable. And so, yeah, like a little bit of unhooking that it's like this podcast is totally about what it is that feels relevant to be talking about. And for me, so I actually started with polyamory, but it was process, promises, pleasure, purpose, and polyamory. So if we go into the process bit of this, I guess I just want to say that if anybody has not yet listened to episode 0, where I read my poem about sourdough, I would just recommend that you check that out because it continues to be such a guiding light for me, is this practice or this process of making sourdough every day. And I will go into that. I guess I'll just go into that right now because I know I have I guess this is kind of funny too. Part of my process since the new moon in Virgo, the beginning of September, so which was my last podcast episode that I released. I have started The Artist's Way, which is that book by Julia Cameron, exploring the creativity of the spiritual path of creativity. And part of that is I do a morning pages practice every morning. And over the last couple weeks, I know that I have just like woken up in the morning and started jotting things down that felt like maybe this is going to be something that I'll be sharing on this intro to season 2 podcast. So I'm reflecting on sourdough as a metaphor, remembering that it is a stand-in for my creativity, that the sourdough is a stand-in for the podcast. And that is that I want it to be a thing that I love doing and that it feeds and fuels me, that it's in service of myself, and I'm just merely sharing it out into the world. And also the importance that sourdough really played on overcoming my perfectionism, that it's like a sourdough practice. And like literally just this morning, side note, like I made a mistake on on my sourdough loaves. Like I forgot to score them. So they like ended up a little bit more dense, but still perfectly like I ate it and will continue to eat from that loaf. But I also recognize that I'm not yet applying that freedom to make mistakes onto the podcast. And so it's as if I were relating how I am with a podcast to sourdough, it would be like I'm trying to inject my sourdough with like all the vitamins and minerals and macronutrients and all free range, gluten-free, ethically sourced product. And it's just like, there's just, those things are just like not available here, or like, I just don't have capacity. Like, it's like, it's not about making this perfect loaf of sourdough. It's like, I just enjoy making it. I just enjoy eating it. I just enjoy sharing it. And there's often this like, okay, well, if I'm going to do a season on this show, then I want to read all the books that I think are even loosely connected. Like I want to hyperfixate, and that will take me years. But I want to be releasing a podcast on every lunation. I want it, which is basically every 2 weeks, and that feels really doable. but also really scary because there's a regularity to that. And I realized that that's very similar to when I started making sourdough, and it felt super scary, but I just asked myself, for this next month, for this next season, can I just say that I'm going to commit to making sourdough every day? I'm going to commit to putting out a podcast every lunation, and just trust that that's what is being asked of me, that's like what this next breadcrumb, if you will, is.
Oh, that was nice.
Thank you.
I love the metaphor, the parallel between the making the bread and the making this podcast, because there are so many similar threads. And if you do ever figure out how to make vitamin infused free range sourdough bread, there's gonna be a market for that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Which is completely not the point.
Exactly. Which is absolutely not, I think that if it ever becomes about that, is like the day that becomes like a thing that people are like, would be expecting from me, it would be like the day that it would stop being fun. So I think that's like an important thing to remember too. All right. So yeah. So the update around the sourdough is that, right now I'm actually baking 2 loaves every day. I have upped my client list. We have about 20 people now in this group. And I'm also just noticing how much attachment stuff is coming up, and opportunities to really practice living into this value that I have of generosity and just giving with joy, giving with ease, and giving freely. This commitment of community care that just feels very much a part of what I'm really hoping to embody in the podcast. And it feels interesting just how connected the podcast and the sourdough are. It almost makes you wonder if I need a loaf of sourdough in my in my new logo or something.
What do you mean when you say it comes up, that attachment stuff comes up with your generosity? Do you have an example?
Yeah. So yeah, that I find myself getting kind of activated when people are giving me compliments, or maybe even critiquing a particular loaf of bread. For instance, if I would be giving away the loaves today that I know I made a mistake, and then I would have people comment, let's say somebody comments and be like, oh yeah, I get that you made this mistake, and then pointing out all the ways that, and it's just oh yeah, you're telling me all the things I did wrong. And it's and also I already know that the point isn't that I'm making a perfect loaf of sourdough, yet there's still going to be people out there that are going to just tell me that, tell me how I can get better, when I don't care about self-improvement in that area.
And I think that's interesting. And I think an even more interesting and juicier story is a real one, a non-hypothetical one, when you gave somebody a loaf of the bread that you made and they were praising you and talking about how good it is and how cool it is and how open the crumb is, and going down the sourdough vernacular. And that caused activation in you too.
Totally. Yeah, no, exactly. Receiving compliments, just even the act of it really is just being seen. Because every time I'm sharing bread, I'm literally seeing someone, giving them a thing, reaching out, I have this thing to offer. Does anybody want it? And then just being seen for this thing that I'm doing. But yeah, the attachment stuff can certainly be where it can be hard to receive compliments as well. So yeah, there's lots more I could say about that, but I think I'm going to put a pin in that for now. And yeah, just within the last month, I've made so many just little mistakes with bread. I forgot to feed my starter one day, and then I totally shifted my schedule, and then I was making it really, really late in the day. There was a time I balanced up. Anyway, it's just all the different ways that it can be messed up, and it continues to be we've yet to throw away bread. So since the last episode, the sourdough practice has almost doubled. There's lots of practice that I've had in this like imposter syndrome, unasked for advice, what it is for me to even be making requests that people be picking up their bread at a particular time so I'm not like wasting energy in my day. Yeah, there's something about like I'm trying to give this thing and like exerting that I have boundaries over what it is that I'm willing to offer and where it is that I'm like not willing to consent to leaking energy. And a big part of that is like wishy-washiness around like, okay, I'm going to give somebody bread. They say they want the bread. And then like, they're not going to tell me how they're going to pick it up. But like, I've never asked them to tell me like, please let me know by this certain time. So then I'm just like leaking all this energy out in like, well, maybe they're going to get back to me, or I better not leave in case they might come. And so it's like, all I have to do is just make a request like, hey, please let me know, before the day of that this is that like there's an empowerment in the sourdough process too of this chapter that like I wasn't necessarily a thing that was noteworthy last season, but within the last month, as I've really just kind of been resting and churning on what's next for the podcast, I've just noticed that is that's come up. And also really also when I say the attachment stuff is coming up, that other people are having issues receiving too much, that like asking for what it is that they want. And
because you offer on your WhatsApp thread for swapping sourdough,
right,
you offer either a whole loaf or a half loaf,
right,
and people will often indicate that they want a half loaf, even though they probably would eat a whole loaf, but
right,
they don't want to seem greedy or selfish,
right. And so like the attachment stuff is totally going both ways, right? Like I feel my attachment stuff is triggered, and then I see things like this where then it's still ultimately my activation, because I then just start thinking like, are people really only eating a half loaf? Like some of these people I know might only eat a half loaf, but there are other people that like they have like a big family, and like I know you're going to want to have more than half loaf, but like this not wanting to ask too much when I'm saying like I want you to ask me for stuff.
So here's what this is making me think though, is what you're riffing on right now is a part of the sourdough swap that is related to other people.
Yeah.
But when you're producing this podcast, you don't have anyone else. You have yourself.
Right.
So I'm wondering how these lessons relate to this podcast.
Yes, that's a great question. I think that I have in my head, there is still this question of like, what is the podcast for? And like, I'm thinking that I'm doing it for other people. And that's when I start losing track of what it is that I'm doing and why. And it's like, I have to remember that like, I am first and foremost, I am making sourdough because I like making sourdough. The fact that I have 14 loaves of sourdough every week that people need to eat is like that's like a byproduct of this sourdough practice that I have. Just like if I were to paint every day, I would just start accumulating paintings. And then it's like, I'm either giving away my paintings or I'm selling my paintings. And I don't want to sell my sourdough. So I'm like figuring out how to give it away. But I'm just also telling people, if you want to give me something, I don't want your money, but I'll take whatever else you feel like you can just give. I don't want it to feel transactional. And I don't ever want my podcast to feel like, I want to just keep that in mind with like that these podcasts are just byproducts of a practice that I am doing, which is like the stoner story witch, right? Like communing with plant medicine, communing with stories, and like finding the cracks in the wall for liberation. And what I really also want for this season that I know that's related to process is connecting with people. Like I really want to, as opposed to season 1 where it was just me talking into a mic the whole time, I do want to reach out and have conversations with people, have them on the podcast, whether it's friends, like, or family members, or like, mentors or teachers. And attachment shit's going to come in.
Is that the plan?
So that is my plan. So this next season is going to be, my best friend suggested, as I was working on the Little Women, this story came to me. I was in the middle of editing Little Women, and my best friend was like, oh my gosh, I really like this show. I just watched it. And then I ended up watching, it was like a show that was resourcing me as I was in the thick of all the editing and all the clickety clicks in the last season. And then I just realized just how a lot of the liberation themes of Little Women and Hadestown are in this show. And so I really, really want to have my best friend on this season. And then I'm still, I also have this full moon, and this podcast I'm hoping is being released. Well, it's being released in honor of the full moon in Aries. The last full moon in Aries was a supermoon, so it was last October, and that was like the big email that I sent all my friends that I wanted to like create this like creativity group to try to connect with our creativity. And it was really like what I wanted more than anything was to have like a group of people that would help me midwife out this first season of the podcast. And like, I did it and it's done. And now it's this like other cycle is starting over. And then if I'm thinking like, maybe what I'll do is I'll email all those same people and I'll say, here, I'm doing this season and it's on this story and I want to talk about these themes. Would you be interested in coming on my show in a friendship capacity of just like as a friend and talk about maybe like the more personal sides of these things? But then I also have teachers and guides and mentors and authors that I could be like, maybe even like that next step of vulnerability or exposure would be like emailing those people and saying, okay, I'm doing this next season and I would love to have you on my podcast. Hey, Carmen Spaniola, would you come on to my podcast and talk about disorganized attachment in fascist and cult-like settings, right? And that feels super fun and exciting. And when I get excited, my fear response also gets triggered so that it's just like, but then I just think back to like the sourdough. It's like, I'm not doing this for my friends. I'm not doing this for my teachers. I'm not doing this for any audience aside from just that, like, it's my own pleasure and my own purpose, which were two of the P words of today's episode as well. Right. Like, yeah.
So I'm observing your excitement, and I've told you before, I like excited Kristen, and there might be someone, probably not that many since this podcast is called Stoner Story Witch, but there might be a person that listens to this that maybe isn't super into astrology. And I'm not super into astrology, but I'm married to you, so I'm adjacently aware of a decent amount. And you bringing up the fact that it's a full moon in Aries, and that the last time that happened was a year ago, and that was a supermoon. I found myself just feeling really grounded in the noticing of the cycle of things. Mm-hmm. And then I'm also observing your excitement. And so for any astrological skeptics out there, I just have to say that even if you don't believe your horoscope, it's kind of a nice way to mark the passing of time. And totally. And if you feel excitement in you, then who cares where it came from?
Right.
You know? And also I have to say, with the producer hat on, I also am thinking in the mind of a listener, and it's killing me to not know what season 2, what show are we talking about here?
Yes. Okay, I will get to that, but I also just want to say, and I'm glad you mentioned it, that a big help that I have in this process of like coming back to like the astrology and like mapping out cycles of time, you know, like months in a year, are like the moon cycles. Is Sarah Faith Gottesdiener. She's like, I think if it weren't for like the moon planner that she puts out, I think this is my 3rd year of journaling with her lunar calendar that she puts out every year. And she's actually a person that I will probably reach out to as far as being a guest on the podcast. The idea of like her being interested in coming on the show to talk about like resourcing or reconnecting to a spiritual part of ourselves would like make me really excited. Okay, so I am ready to talk about this next season that I'm hoping to get to.
I'm making a note right here to insert drum roll.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you were actually doing something. This next season is going to be on Severance, season 1 of Severance, which is a thriller that came out in 2022 and on Apple TV. Yes, produced and streamable on Apple TV. And I will say that whether it feels like I'm choosing Severance or whether it feels like Severance chose me, feels like an interesting question, because as I mentioned, it's a show that I was watching while I was editing season 1. It was a show that my best friend had recommended to me. And so we actually created a little WhatsApp chat for it, and we left memos to one another. So like it's like this shared rhythm. And when we remember that attachment is about, safe touch, kind eyes, vocal prosody, ingestion behaviors, and shared rhythm, there was this like shared rhythm that my best friend and I had, that even though we don't even live in the same country, we were like watching this show, and I would finish an episode and then I would leave a little voice memo to her and just talk all about the attachment stuff and questions I had. And then she would respond and send me ones in return. And it just, and then I also noticed as I was editing that I said the word severance many times in the actual season in the Little Women season. And I had recorded Little Women before I even had registered that there was a show called Sever. Like it just wasn't even on my radar until my best friend said that she had watched it and really wanted me to watch it. And so it's something like that feels like a synchronicity, that feels like a breadcrumb. And remembering that this podcast to me is about exploring stories as a roadmap to liberation. Adrienne Marie Brown, I just was rereading her book, Emergent Strategy, and she calls it like a visionary fiction. That Severance is a show that I think has so many similar themes with Hadestown and with Little Women. It's about a severance from secure attachment with others that leaves us abandoning parts of ourselves. There's this underworld at Lumen that is this reconnection with the lost parts. Like it's who we have to, the parts of ourselves that we have to sacrifice in order to be successful within capitalist paradigms.
I want to go back to the second to last thing that you just said.
Yeah.
Where you said it's a severance of our secure attachment.
A severance from our secure attachment with ourselves.
But I would argue that in the show, the people who choose to be severed and go to work and not remember their away from work life, and then when they leave work, they can't remember their work life when they're at home. Mm-hmm. So I would argue that all attachment is being severed. Like that's part of the benefit for the, someone who's depressed in the real world.
I see what you're saying. Yes. And I will get to that in the official season. So yes, I'm just saying that like there's so many different levels that we can be looking at with secure attachment with ourselves, secure attachment with the land, secure attachment with one another, how attachment systems can actually be manipulated and coerced. And yeah, there's also a liberatory work. There are wealth wounds that must be there in order for those systems of domination and oppression to continue. And so I have the breadcrumbs of what the themes of Severance are going to be. It's my hope that within the next couple weeks, I will have at least a season of, or an episode of the Severance season. But at this point, I just wanted to officially put out a podcast to just say that I'm still here. I'm still doing it. I'm still committed to the work of the Stoner Story Witch. It feels very much like it's a thing that I'm doing. It's a practice that I'm communing with, and it isn't necessarily like it's like that there's like a detachment that I have, like it isn't it, and I'm remembering this is a line from the poem, like it isn't me and it isn't mine. It's like a playful work. It's a practice. It's a process. And so I have process, promises, pleasure, purpose, and polyamory. And so my promise is, the promises that I think I feel comfortable making is that I will be, for the next little season here, probably until the winter solstice. My hope is to be releasing a podcast with every lunation. I will be returning to Minnesota for a few weeks. So it might get a little bit iffy in November with how the schedule goes, but it is definitely, I have the intent to make good on the commitment. Maybe I should say it's commitment, a little bit less strong than promises, but that I'll be putting out a podcast with every lunation, and the reminder that I'm doing it to follow like what feels right, and that it needs to be, that I need to lean into the pleasure of it.
I'm so glad you got to the pleasure, because that was the fifth P that we didn't spend really any time with.
Yeah. Well, yes, I'm coming back to it. And yes, that it's like, I want to, as I think we kind of said, like take the should out of it, that it's like, I'm doing this because it is, it's the thing that I keep every morning I wake up and I do my art, like my morning pages, and like the same, like it's like these recurring things that are just always right there. And I feel like I just have to put it out. So, it is about pleasure. It is about sharing. And I think the sharing or the giveaway is related to the purpose, and it's around finding the cracks in the wall for liberation, and sharing it with the world, and just being in connection with not just the community that I am able to like share my bread with, or lead a women's group, or be in those kinds of communities, but also that like there is some like seed scattering that I'm willing to share with some wider world, anybody on the internet that can find this, and is watching the same stories I'm watching, and asking the same questions, or at the same thresholds, that like maybe we can all just feel a little less alone. And I think that's a big part of the purpose. And then again, back to the polyamory, that it's like, it 100% is, I am doing the podcast when I'm making bread. That like, that there is, my podcast will be better by me making bread, and like I will be a more resourced person, like, baker, by having the podcast. And maybe I'm committing to doing a season on Severance, but maybe in the middle of Severance, I'm going to do an episode about just some reality TV show, because that is like a thing that just feels super juicy. And like, I'm like giving myself the freedom to maybe like release a couple episodes of one season, and then just like do a random episode on something else that just feels pleasurable, is gonna be what I'm going to, that pleasure is going to be a priority over like the cohesiveness of like, but I need to finish I need to wrap up one season before I do something else. And it's just funny, like saying that out loud into a microphone that's being recorded, because I do feel like that is like a thing that I need to remember for myself, that because it goes back to the should, that like, well, but any other podcast that you would listen to, like anybody who's trying to get people to like listen to their podcast is going to want to be like having a much more regular distribution schedule than Illumination is going to want to be having an entire season wrapped up before you just start having random episodes about other things. But I'm not doing this for anybody else. And so I think it's just a recommitment to that. And I'm feeling like I've done a lot of rambling, and I'm hoping that that feels like it makes sense. And maybe it doesn't have to make sense.
It only has to make sense to you,
I guess. But yeah, it feels complete from a sound editor, co-producer standpoint. Is there anything that you feel like we're missing? It's Severance, baby.
I want to leave feeling pumped up for season 2 whenever it comes.
Yeah.
Because the actual season 2 of Severance comes out.
Yes, in January. So
January 2025.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that. Is actually so. My best friend found out that my birthday is December 6th, and that is the day that Mars goes retrograde. And she didn't even realize this. She just knew that Mars was going retrograde in December, and that Mars is a planet of severance. And retro is like when you're like, if anything's going retrograde, you're supposed to like review or like revise. It's like the rule of re's. Anytime you're something. And she just made the comment like, what a cool thing to do for Mars retrograde, to like review and like rehash all that we had, because we've already had these conversations. We had these conversations last May via little voice memos to each other. And so like, what might it look like for her and me to have some of those conversations over the coming weeks? But maybe I'm not actually releasing a Severance podcast until December 6th, which is the day of the Mars retrograde. But my hope is that I will at least be done with those episodes by the time season 2 of Severance comes out, because I definitely don't want to get all jumbled with whatever they bring up for season 2, because of course I have like my questions or my predictions, and I will likely be wrong. So if you don't have Apple TV, find a way to watch Severance
it. Season 1. And even if you can't find a way to watch it, if you've ever done any work, if you've ever had a job,
yep,
you will relate.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if it wouldn't be helpful for me to give like just a little pitch on like what Severance is about and what I'm hoping to discuss. But yeah, so Severance is just this show. It's a show that takes place in kind of this, it's kind of this timelessness. It's this weird dystopian timeless setting, it feels, where like the technology is both really futuristic, but also seems really like old. Like the computer monitors are huge, and like there's like still flip phones, cell phones, but then they have this like weird technology where you can like actually sever yourself from like your work self and your outer life. So they call it like your innie and your outie. And so you're basically creating this like indentured servant class of workers that are just, they like are stuck at work. They never get to go home. They never get to leave. And also, so there's definitely the question, when I think of season 1 having this question of secure attachment and the male gaze, I think the equivalent is secure attachment within capitalism, a secure attachment within a workforce. And then when we look at how, there's moments of in episode 2 of season 1, we looked at moments of misattunement and contact nutrition in the wild, and looking at how in Severance season 1, contact nutrition is used to manipulate and coerce, is used among these how basically it's co-opted to create like this high demand cultish setting. And so there's like this question of like how are we subjecting ourselves to this systemic, I was going to say misattunement, but it is just this systemic manipulation. And and what I also just think is really interesting with the crack in the wall is that there is a liberatory work. Just like in Hadestown, there is a song that Orpheus has that's going to like bring the world back into tune. And just like how Jo has this creative writing, this creative practice or this writing that that's going to help her be seen in this world that doesn't want to see her. There is this book. There is this bright orange book that finds its way onto the severed floor, where all these innies of these workers find this book, and it feels like liberation because it is the only piece of information that isn't propaganda that they get exposed to, and just the effect that even like a super simplistic or even like flawed book in a lot of ways, like a small amount of resistance, a small amount of liberation can be exactly what is needed in order for like revolutionary change to happen. And then I don't want to I want to give maybe people time to watch Severance. So I'll just say that wealth wounding is a very big theme as well. There's a particular character. I don't want to spoil anything, but there's a particular character that really appeals to me when we consider that there is the severance that we have to have with our own sense of a shared humanity. And what happens when you can actually like feel into like solidarity with the working class as somebody who is in a very high position of power within these systems of domination and oppression and capitalism. So,
and not to be too basic of a bro, but there's also a very obvious commentary just about the working world and all the little tchotchkes that companies will give their employees, and on and on and on.
Totally. Right. Yeah, totally. Like this. Yeah. The very, like the way that we incentivize people, is.
And the absurdity of it.
Yeah. Lots of absurdity. There's lots of collapse, lots of commentary. I'm excited to get into it. Absolutely. So thank you so much for listening to this episode 0.1, the ManifestDough. And I am thankful for Kevin joining me today for moral support and helping me with my clickety clicks. And look forward to seeing what I'm releasing in another 2 weeks for the next Lunation, and looking forward to releasing Severance as those episodes are ready, as I'm reaching out to people in my close circle or circle of mentors and teachers and guides. And looking forward to seeing what this next year holds.
Keep it witchy out there.